phrase identity politics. Because let's be clear, when people say that, it's a pejorative. That phrase is used to divide and it is used to distract. Its purpose is to minimize and marginalize issues that impact all of us. It is used to try and shut us up.
The term identity politics has been overused in the mainstream media, mainly by politicians and reactionary political pundits. It's been called a dividing force that distracts Americans, but what does it actually mean and where does the term come from? During this time, there was a lot of racial unrest and violence that was happening against the Black community in Boston, especially against Black women. Black women faced sterilization abuse, abortion rights, lack of access to healthcare, domestic violence, and racial and sexual trauma and assault. Black women were facing extreme violence, and organizations did not have an analysis for what Black women were going through. White feminist organizations lacked the racial analysis, and Black male-led organizations lacked a gender analysis. 3 years after the collective started the organization, they created the Come By Keep It for Collective Statement in 1977. The CRC was aware that no one took their oppression as seriously as them. They state, "This focusing upon our oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics comes directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression." The CRC really became known in Boston after organizing around the Roxbury murders. The collective created pamphlets bringing attention to the violence Black women face that no one seemed to care about. Some of the victims were as young as 15 years old. In 1979, the CRC organized a protest to bring national awareness to the Black women that were being murdered and received no media attention. So what exactly is identity politics? The CRC acknowledged that they had to actively struggle against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression simultaneously. The CRC stated that major systems of oppression were interlocking. In order to have a fully developed analysis around the institutions that control our lives, like schools, work, healthcare, government, and policing, they must be studied in conjunction with one another. In other words, the synthesis of our oppressions creates the conditions of our lives. Here, Barbara Smith, one of the creators of the CRC, clearly states the point of the CRC.
Even though we talked about the concept of identity politics, what we really meant by that is that Black women have a right to set political agendas. That's all that we meant. That's all that we meant. We did not mean that everybody who wasn't a Black woman, a young Black woman, because we were all in our 20s at that point, some of us were a little bit older, but we weren't saying that if you were not a younger Black woman, probably a lesbian, not everybody in the collective was a lesbian, but most of us were, and whatever other identifiers, if you're not just like us, then you have no place in this struggle.
The collective understood that people with particular identities have particular struggles when trying to survive in this white supremacist, capitalist, heteronormative society that we live in. Word to Bell Hooks. Here, Smith also explains the importance of the CRC backing the lesbian and gay liberation movement in the 1970s.
Our lesbian and gay liberation movement was at the time, it was like, we all need to come out of the closet. We are all fighting vicious homophobia, dangerous homophobia, violent homophobia, hate crimes, and in many cases, murders. So it was no joke. This is very serious. But what identity politics would bring to that was that, but if you are a Black trans woman, you're in a different relationship to those issues that seemingly have been already defined. So we have to look at the specificity of who we are to figure out the solutions for what we face.
One of the cruelest symptoms of the heteropatriarchal society that we live in is constant homophobia. However, identity politics provides a framework for folks that are marginalized with already marginalized communities. One system of oppression could not be fully and accurately analyzed without forming an integrated analysis with other systems of oppression. A clear example is the infant mortality rate experienced by Black women specifically. Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth or lose their child during childbirth compared to their white counterparts. in the US. This is because of the medical discrimination that Black women have historically faced. Black women are the reason that we have birth control today because of the experiments that were done on our bodies without our consent. This is how race and healthcare intersect. Analyzing these two institutions individually will create different solutions and will leave marginalized communities to fend for themselves. The CRC created identity politics in this statement as a tool for organizing their community using a socialist and anti-imperialist framework. Any analysis that attempts to describe identity politics without surveying the system of oppression that we live in, the economic system of capitalism, or the global imperialism that takes place by the US in the global South and Africa, then the analysis is incomplete and therefore inaccurate. So if we know that identity politics used today isn't the same as what it was originally coined as, then how did it get co-opted? Co-opting means to divert or use in a role different from the original or intended meaning. The current definition of identity politics is not the same as the one that the CRC used. According to Google, identity politics is a tendency for people of a particular religion, race, social background, etc. to form exclusive political alliances, moving away from traditional broad-based politics. As humans, we are complex, multifaceted creatures. However, this definition of identity politics from Google dismisses any kind of intersection of identities and completely dismisses any economic standing. In How We Get Free, Demeter Frazier, one of the founders of the Come By Whoever collective, tells us why the collective separated from the National Black Feminist Organization. She states, "So we evolved out of the NBFO, and once we began meeting and talking and realized we were more radical and we were wanting a different kind of structure. We wanted to have an economic analysis as well. We weren't willing to just have a discussion about sort of fitting into mainstream capitalist thinking. Forced integration of identity politics under capitalism consequently changed the entire meaning of the word. So identity politics was a term that was supposed to be used to combat all forms of oppression. When the term is used for one's own personal benefit or individualist purposes, it loses meaning completely. The de-radicalization of identity politics is rooted in America's fear of any anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist rhetoric sounding sensible." Sean Combs, aka P. Diddy, used a co-opted version of identity politics to mobilize the Black community against corporate America. In his letter to corporate America, Diddy explains his frustration, stating, "When confronted by the leaders of several Black-owned media companies, General Motors listed my network, Revolt, as an example of the Black-owned media it supports. While Revolt does receive advertising revenue from GM, our relationship is not an example of success. Instead, Revolt, just like other Black-owned media companies, fights for crumbs, while GM makes billions of dollars every year from the Black community." Exposing GM's historic refusal to fairly invest in Black-owned media is not an assassination of character. It's exposing the way GM and many other advertisers have always treated us. No longer can corporate America manipulate our community into believing that incremental progress is an acceptable action. Is this the same Diddy that was put on blast for not paying his own artists? Further down the letter, he uses stats to further prove his point. What Diddy failed to realize is identity politics will only resonate with folks if your politic and values is rooted in anti-capitalist rhetoric. Individualism is a situation when an individual is concerned about themselves and or their close family members only. If the way you move and do business is rooted in individualism and capitalism, then the community support you receive, if any, will be tribalistic in nature. According to Paul James, customary tribalism is defined as the framing condition of a certain kind of community in which persons are bound beyond immediate family ties by the dominance of modalities of face-to-face and object integration, including genealogical placement, embodied reciprocity, and mythological inquiry. Historically, the most sustained of these modalities have proved to be genealogical, in other words, familial or ancestral lineage, That is, extended kinship relations, either blood related or constituted around other ways of placement. But this on its own does not make a tribe. So, what is it supposed to mean to us as Black people when P. Diddy is penning a letter to corporate America trying to get us to mobilize something he cares about? But he's notorious for not paying his artists, and he doesn't critique capitalism or exploitation. If Diddy was historically invested in the Black community, Diddy wasn't known for not paying his artists and a part of rise and grind culture, and that's how you were supposed to get to the top, then I'm sure people would have rallied behind him. For sure. In order for Diddy to do that, he would have had to divest from capitalism, not only in rhetoric but in practice. And that's something he wasn't willing to do. Tribalism will never disrupt individualism. It'll only get a few people to mobilize around something you care about, but it won't inspire the masses. Only true collectivism, which is a component of socialism, will bring change that inspires people. That's exactly what the Combahee River Collective did. One thing I will always continue to repeat is how Democrats and Republicans are two sides of the same coin. Both denounce identity politics with different talking points, but for the same reason.
Identity politics used to be a rallying cry for the left. It was a positive thing. Now when you mention it, it's an insult.
Right.
And the reason is because ultimately the consequences of identity politics is putting the group before the individual. And what happens is everybody who are in their specific groups then have to feel that their group is somehow more important than the other group. So what you end up having are warring factions. And you're seeing it a lot of times where one group accuses another group of cultural appropriation, and then another group accuses that group of something else. Ultimately, it's going to turn on itself. This is why Trump won, was because he was talking about one identity politic, which was American. Now, then you have the left saying, no, that's racist, because what you're really saying is white when you're talking about America. That's the consequence of identity politics, is what they're saying is that if you are white, you are part of the oppressor group. And it's the identity. And so when you say identity politics, you're obviously racist. So that's nothing good can come from identity politics because in its heart, it's about division.
Republicans and Democrats are both proponents for capitalism and individualist values. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps type narratives. But that's what the American dream is based on. Republicans and Democrats both state that identity politics create division, but the co-optation of identity politics is what is actually creating this division among folks most vulnerable to capitalism. That's pretty much everyone besides the 1%, and everyone the 1% buys out to keep their propaganda going, like politicians. So the co-opted version of identity politics seeks to set a standard of who can and who cannot talk about certain systems of oppression. The co-opting of identity politics has allowed people to move into a victimhood mentality instead of actually analyzing the systems of oppression that control our lives and put us in these situations. It's not our identities that put us in these situations, it's the systems. So people in positions of power will rarely critique the power that put them in those positions. Kamala Harris is an imperialist agent of America who has incentive to inaccurately tell us the definition of identity politics before she has any incentive to tell us how devastating American capitalism and imperialism has been. And going back even to European imperialism. No one wants to talk about that history. When we really begin to interrogate systems that created individualism rooted in capitalism, then we begin to see why the term was co-opted in the first place. One of the reasons I think identity politics was co-opted and de-radicalized is because it has its roots in socialism. I mean, the definition on Google is lackluster and propagandized. It disregards a complete nuance of all the Combahee River Collective did to create this definition in the first place. And how we get free, Beverly Smith emphasizes the amount of study and development it went to in creating the organization, let alone putting out this statement 3 years later. The true definition of identity politics seeks to decenter individualism, a key component of capitalism. Brian Turner argues that the classical perspective of capitalism produces individualism as a necessary and compatible ideology of private property. But individualism was also thought to be corrosive of communal and social ties, having effects that were regarded to be deleterious at both the individual and social levels. We cannot reject individualism by forming weak social bonds and having little to no reciprocity like P. Diddy did in his letter to corporate America. The opposite of individualism isn't customary tribalism, where you identify with someone loosely upon something like your skin color, but it's collectivism, a key component to socialism. Collectivism can be defined as a cluster of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors toward a wide variety of people. The difference can be expressed by the range of social concern, which refers to bonds and links with others. Having a collectivist mindset is thinking none of us are free until all of us are free. Not, if P. Diddy makes more money, then maybe we can make some more money from corporate America too. We need to get rid of corporate America as a whole, not get a seat at their table. It's not about inherently calling someone good or bad because they hold a certain identity. The true definition of identity politics doesn't seek to inherently name someone good or bad because of an identity that they hold in society. It's about recognizing what identity you hold and how that impacts the conditions of your lives. And it's about recognizing the identities that other folks might hold and how that impacts the conditions of their lives under these violent systems of oppression. Identity politics doesn't advocate Black people being the only voices for racial oppression, but we must be clear that white supremacy impacts Black people to varying degrees depending on identities that they hold in society. It's all about nuance. Ask yourself, who does your politics represent and who does it dismiss? Identity politics in the intersection of one's identity is nuance. And America has a history of suppressing and rewriting any information that does not fit into the good or bad binary. Moreover, if it doesn't show America being the top nation in the world, then the history will be rewritten as something bad and not to be used. When we hear the term identity politics, we must always think about the Combahee River Collective first and what they intended to do with the term. The Combahee River Collective was started because of the violence against Black women and the lack of attention that was coming from it. We have to be honest about the violence and the murders of Black women that became the catalyst for this term to even be defined in the first place. Identity politics goes further than the jargon. It's about the real violence that Black women were facing during the early 70s. When we hear the term identity politics, it doesn't center around community organizing or destruction of capitalism, global imperialism, heteropatriarchy, the system of domination, etc., then we need to be able to recognize that that term is the co-opted version of identity politics. It is not the original definition that came from the Combahee River Collective. Samita Frazier stated, "It's interesting because we never actually, as far as I can tell, as far as the classical definition, really practiced what people now call identity politics. Because the center and the center focus was not an aspect of our identity, but the totality of what it meant to be a Black woman in the diaspora. As a young Black woman that comes from a relatively privileged socioeconomic background, I have to actively be conscious about rejecting bourgeoisie ideals. Those kinds of ideals have been conditioned within me since I was a child. I have to continually reject individual aspiration and stay community-minded because I have the ability to be a part of the talented 10th whenever I want to. I know my individual success in proximity to white spaces is not how we all get free, despite how many times we've been told to give back to where we came from. I recognize my identity and the intersections of privilege that I stand at. Instead of feeling guilty about those advantages, I need to be active about dismantling those violent institutions that make those advantages possible." The Combahee River Collective intended identity politics to be a framework for marginalized folks that have experienced physical, social, economic, political, and spiritual violence under these violent institutions and advocate accordingly. The CRC worked in coalitions with many other third world women, building solidarity with any movement that aligned with overthrowing capitalism and imperialism. They knew that this would lead to true collective power. In the words of Audre Lorde, it's about defining and empowering, not dividing and conquering. We must fight for our own liberation by interrogating the systems that cause violence in our lives and the lives of colonized peoples around the world. We cannot uplift identities that are seen as beneficial and advantages under these violent systems. We must amplify, listen to, and give the megaphone to folks that are most harmed by these violent systems. That's how we get free.